Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Dean Young from the University of Michigan, and you also see on your screen Gaurav Khanna from UC San Diego. We're very happy to see everybody who's attending today. Let me start sharing my screen. All right, Gaurav, can you give me a thumbs up that you can see my cursor? All right, thank you. Today's lecture in the BRED Development Economics course is on international migration. Our focus here there's many questions one can ask about international migration on the planet. Our focus here will be its impacts on development outcomes in developing countries. So we're not going to be talking at all about international migration and its impacts on host countries, which are mostly developed countries. This is going to be from the standpoint of development economics. So I will speak for about 55 minutes. I'll pause for questions at a number of places during the talk. Gaurav will then present a paper of his for about 25 minutes, and we hope to have some time for open questions at the end, and we're going to go for about 90 minutes. Let me start off by setting the stage here in terms of the global context of migration. So international migrants on the planet have been roughly stable as a share of world population at about 3% of world population. This goes back to the data that the UN, this has been relatively stable since the UN has been reporting these data since the 1960s. The absolute number of migrants on the planet has been rising with world population from about 100 million in 1960 to more than 200 million in the recent decade. So substantial numbers of people on the planet are living outside their countries of birth, are international migrants. These migrants are only a share of the individuals on the planet who would like to migrate. So, because we all know that there are substantial barriers to migration across borders in the world today. And so a much larger share of individuals on the planet would like to migrate. According to the Gallup World Poll, about 13% of world population would like to move across a border, but haven't done so. Here's some nice tabulations from the Gallup World Poll data put together by the World Bank. So the share of individuals saying they would like to live in another country varies across regions of the world. So this 13% obscures some regional variation. The share is highest in sub-Saharan Africa, where 30% of respondents say yes, they'd like to migrate. Europeans come next at about 20%. And in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as in Latin America and the Caribbean, the share isn't very different from the European share, also about close to 20%. In other regions of the world, the shares are lower, but still larger than the ultimate share that have actually migrated. So the share is lowest in East Asia and Southeast Asia and South Asia at about 7 or 8%. But again, these 7 or 8% are still much larger than the shares that have actually migrated. And this sort of averages out globally to about 30% of respondents. Where did people say they want to go? Just you might be curious. Gallup also asks about this. The number one destination that migrants say they want to go if they migrate is the United States. So about 1 in 5 intended destinations is the U.S. And then we've got this a scattering of other usual suspects here, individual named countries. Saudi Arabia shows up here in the top 10, reflecting the fact that the Middle East is a major destination of labor migrants on the planet, as those of us who study international migration know quite well. Lots of people want to migrate. Why do they want to migrate? Well, perhaps the biggest reason is that the income gains from labor migration to the developed world are tremendous. Sharing here some nice data put together by, on the one hand, David McKenzie, Steve Stillman, and John Gibson from a set of studies they've done in the South Pacific, taking advantage of exogenous variation stemming from visa lotteries when people in Tonga get the opportunity to migrate to a developed country in New Zealand. Prior to migration, the income of migrants and non-migrants is similar, but then after migration, 1 year later, we see a tremendous several-fold increase in income for the folks who got the opportunity to migrate versus those that didn't. And that gain persists, and if anything, increases even further if you look 9 or 10 years later. So just, this is one out of many examples one can look at, but it's a very nice example because it's based on, a visa lottery. So as close to a national experiment one can get, close to an RCT one can get in a real world policy implementation. When people get an opportunity to migrate, their income goes up several-fold. Data not from an RCT, but also quite credible in my mind, was put together over here on the right-hand graph by Clemens, Montenegro, and Pritchett. So a very nice paper that came out in Restat in 2019, showing looking at census data in the US as well as labor force survey data in a variety of countries around the world, looking at how wages differ between observably identical individuals observed in sort of origin country labor force surveys versus US labor force surveys. You might look at, for example, an individual born in the Philippines with 9 years of education, male, age 30 to 34. What is their income? What is their income per hour in the Philippines versus in the US? And you see just a fourfold increase for the person who happens to be located in the US versus in the Philippines. Again, these are all sort of observably identical individuals born in the Philippines, same observable characteristics, but one happens to be located in the US and working in the US, and one happens to be back home in the Philippines. And you can do this calculation for, I think they do this for dozens of different countries. And in almost all cases, the income gain is several-fold. I think the smallest income gain they report is a doubling of wages, and the largest income gain they report is in the order of a 15-fold increase in wages. And these are just 4 examples from all of the tabulations they do. Now, of course, this is an observational comparison, not based on a random assignment of someone to the US versus their home country, but I think they do quite a credible job arguing that only a small portion of this difference in income is likely to be due to selection, on observables. The vast majority of this difference is likely to be due to increases, the causal impact of moving across a border from a developing country to the US labor market. So, I think that this is about all I'm going to say about this sort of, research establishing that migration leads to huge gains when one moves from a developing to a developed country. But one thing I wanted to show that, to put this in context with some nice data put together by Pritchett, basically comparing the gains from migration, from labor migration from a developing to a developed country, to gains from perhaps the most impactful anti-poverty intervention that has been studied recently by development economists. So looking at the ultra-poor graduation program implemented by the NGO BRAC in many different countries. This was the subject of a very nice paper in Science by about a dozen prominent development economists documenting large gains in income from this program that is anchored by an asset transfer, but is complemented by a multifaceted set of other interventions like health and education interventions, to complement the asset transfer. The number here, about $1,100 US, is the lifetime net present value of the gain from the graduation anti-poverty program, the average across the 5 countries listed here: Ethiopia, India, Ghana, Pakistan, and Peru. So quite a substantial gain. But Pritchett and Honey's point is that this gain is dwarfed by just a little bit of international migration. So, for example, if you compare that gain to the gain from 1 year working in the US versus working back home in these 5 countries, and that's sort of that calculation is based on the Clemens, Montenegro, and Pritchett paper data from that paper that I mentioned in the previous slide. Just 1 year working in the US versus one of these home countries yields gains that are almost an order of magnitude larger, about $8,700. And then if we think about even more years spent in the U.S. labor market, the gains just become, phenomenal, and there really just is no comparison. So 5 years working in the U.S. versus these same 5 countries leads to gains of, exceeding $50,000, and then a lifetime, 40 years working in the U.S. Leads to gains of close to $230,000. So there's really no comparison between the income gains associated with moving from a developing to a developed country versus any known anti-poverty program that we study as development economists. It's really the scale of gains in income is just on a different, completely different order of magnitude. So this, this has all been talking about just the gains to the migrants themselves. But why do we, and that certainly is something we should care about. The well-being of the migrants themselves is important from a human well-being standpoint. But as development economists, there is some debate as to whether this by itself should be sufficient for trying to promote international migration as a development policy to some degree. Some, not the people on this call, I think, but I think some would argue that once an individual leaves the home country, they don't necessarily count as someone from a developing country, and we really want to think about the impacts on the families back home or the areas from which the migrants come. Certainly that's true in general. We should care about impacts on home areas, and the potential impacts on home areas or home households, people remaining back in the home country are potentially tremendous as well. And perhaps the easiest way of seeing that potential is just by looking at the magnitude of migrant remittances as a financial flow in aggregate going back to developing countries. So these migrants are going overseas. They're not just sitting on and enjoying their higher incomes overseas. They're sending back tremendous shares of these earnings to their home countries in the form of remittances. And really, this is where the exciting aspect really comes to the fore from the standpoint of development of migrants' home countries. So these data just sort of make plain how important remittances are as a financial flow going to developing countries. On the vertical axis, we have billions of US dollars, showing basically the four largest types of international financial flows going to developing countries. Foreign direct investment, this green line, remittances, the blue line, portfolio investment, this sort of pinkish line, and this white line, the official development assistance or foreign aid. So the first point is that for the last 2 decades, I've been showing a version of this graph when talking about international migration, and the point has always been that remittances are the number 2 type of international financial flow after foreign direct investment, which gets obviously a huge amount of attention in economics and trade. So remittances have been a respectable number 2, but growing. And finally, in the wake of the pandemic, with the big decline in FDI associated with the pandemic, remittances have remained stable and even grown a little bit, and have actually become the number 1 type of international financial flow going to developing countries. Remittances are, about $500 billion a year, much larger as well than than official development assistance or foreign aid, which is only about $100 billion a year, and larger as well than portfolio investment flows, which are much more volatile. It does look like as we proceed in the next couple of years, FDI is probably going to take back its first place vis-a-vis remittances. But another point that's worth making is that a huge fraction, about 40% of this FDI, is actually FDI going to China specifically. And if you created this graph excluding foreign direct investment to China, or basically excluding China from all of these data, there would be a very large gap between remittances and FDI. Remittances would be a clear number 1 type of international financial flow going to developing countries. So the migrants achieve huge income gains when they move to developed countries for work. The remittances they send back are very important and large type of international financial flow. perhaps it shouldn't be surprising then that international development policy around the world is starting to incorporate international migration into policymaking. So most developing country governments today are incorporating international migration into their development policymaking. This is quite new data. We just put together these data. Gaurav and I and co-authors just put together these data, for a paper I'll be discussing shortly. From a new survey of governments that the UN just did 2 years ago. So I think this was news to us, and I think news to a lot of people. So this, but I think very revealing. So basically, 94% of developing countries with above 1 million population, which is the vast majority of population of the developing world, have a national migration policy agency. 88% have a government unit dedicated to overseas citizens and overseas employment. About 83% say they have a national labor migration strategy. Close to 4 in 5 say they promote fair and ethical treatment of their migrant workers who are going to other countries. And 80% say they promote the flow of remittances. Now, clearly, international migration policy is on the map of policymakers in developing countries, thinking about how they can promote development via promoting international migration. Now, of course, these data don't tell us anything about how important these particular migration policy units, for example, are within government bureaucracies. They could be, 2 people, or they could be thousands of people in the case of the Philippines or other countries that aggressively are involved in international migration of their citizens. So I think an open question is how much should developing countries really dive into trying to promote international migration of their citizens? And a very big aspect of answering that question really is trying to understand what the development impacts are back home. We know that migrants themselves experience huge income gains. They send back large amounts of resources, but what exactly are the impacts on home countries? So that's really what we want to talk about today. As a contextual factor, I did want to sort of compare international, make a slightly apples to oranges comparison here and compare international migration flows with microcredit programs and cash transfers. To perhaps the 2 largest types of international development programs, or development programs, anti-poverty programs that we study as development economists. So based on data from the last several years, there are about 140 million clients of microcredit institutions on the planet, about 185 million beneficiaries of cash transfer programs, mostly conditional cash transfer programs, but also unconditional cash transfer programs on the planet. In comparison, there are about 210 million international labor migrants, according to the UN. So the comparison is a bit apples to oranges, because these international migrants are mostly making decisions on their own, and they're mostly not overseas as a result of some sort of government program or initiative. But I think we need to think about this in the context of the previous slide that basically showed that the vast majority of developing countries are entering into this space and thinking about ways that they might expand the benefits they can get as home countries of migrants from international migration when they send their citizens overseas. And so if countries go big into the international migration policy arena and really try to promote their international migration of their citizens, we could very well see this number rise even further. And actually, international migration might start to seem much more like an explicit government, or the result of an explicit government program. That's all background. What's the agenda for today? We want to think about how international migration affects migrant origin countries, mostly developing countries, in particular developing countries that send migrants overseas. We're going to be thinking, think about, a country that experiences an increase in migration or in migrant income, in out migration, or in migrant income coming, earned by a country's migrants. We can think about what the short run impacts would be on just the households from which the migrants originated. And then we can also think about the longer run impacts on migrant origin areas. the sort of like the broadly, and that gets us much closer to thinking about the long run impacts on economic development of the places from which migrants come. We can also think about financial innovations or other types of interventions that we can implement either as governments, NGOs, or development agencies to help migrant households make better use of migrant remittances. That may be something worth pursuing as well. I may not, in the interest of time, I have some slides on these, and if I have time, we'll get to this last part here, but I may have to leave that for some future presentation. The slides will be there if I don't get to this last part. So let me stop there and see if folks have any questions. Let me just look at the Q&A box here. Okay, I'm very happy to see that folks have been so engrossed by the presentation that they haven't put any questions into the Q&A. That's completely fine. I'll move on, but please put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll stop again in a few slides. Okay. So if we're thinking, first of all, about how international migration or exogenous changes in migrant income that, in the income that migrants are earning, how might that affect origin households back home? I think one benchmark or starting point is just, as we do in economics, is simply to think, okay, if there are no market failures or no significant market failures, what might we expect to happen? I think that the typical presumption, from Econ 101 would be that we should expect consumption to rise and leisure to rise as well in the origin households of migrants. In other words, labor supply to fall. This is often expressed in sort of like the popular press as potentially a negative thing, that sort of remittances make people lazy. That people are sort of quote unquote dependent on remittances. But we all know that from the Econ 101 standpoint, that an increase in consumption, an increase in leisure could be very, very much a very rational response to increase in income from a particular source. Having said that, and as development economists, we're used to thinking about missing markets. If there are missing markets, then we might get different predictions. We might expect, for example, that if there are constraints on investment, then migrant resources can alleviate those constraints. So we might see increased investment in human and physical capital. We also might think about missing markets for insurance, missing markets for dealing with risk. Either sort of missing financial markets for credit and savings, or an incomplete ability to informally share risk between households in a social network. And if we have imperfections in mechanisms for coping with risk, migrants can provide insurance. This particular topic is actually going to be the subject of an entire class taught by Mushfiq Mubarak shortly, coming up in this module of the bread course. So I'm just alluding to this and sort of teeing up that lecture. So a lot of the work that I'll be sharing with you and that that others have done that have been insightful in these questions has to do with the Philippines. So I want to say a brief word about international migration from the Philippines. International migration is a major phenomenon in the country. It affects a substantial share of the population. So maybe about 1 to 2% of the population, depending on which census you look at in the last couple of decades, works overseas. About 5% of households have a migrant, but about 25% receive remittances or some other source of income, mostly remittances, but other sources of income as well from overseas. So international migration touches the lives of at least a quarter of households in the Philippines directly, and certainly has indirect effects by aggregate demand and other general equilibrium effects on the Philippine origin areas more broadly. If you sort of Gaurav, Caroline, Amir, and I in a paper I'll be discussing shortly use some novel data to calculate that migrant income. If you add up income earned by migrants overseas and income earned by households in the Philippines, and consider that global income of the Philippines, migrant income makes up about 12% of Philippine global income. It's a not inconsiderable share of total income in the country. Now, this migration is largely temporary and legal labor migration through licensed recruitment agencies for typically short 2-year contracts, roughly 2-year contracts that people can renew regularly. Filipinos go to a wide variety of different destinations around the world, reflecting the fact that they have, for a number of decades, have had increasingly well-developed institutions to regulate and promote international labor migration. So in this sense, the Philippines is very much on the forefront of efforts to promote international labor migration. It is perhaps the country that has gone the farthest on the planet, among countries, developing countries, to facilitate and promote international labor migration of its citizens. But for that reason, I think it's precisely the country that we should be studying to understand the development impacts of international labor migration. So basically, every other country should be, I think, looking at the Philippines and trying to understand the impacts of international labor migration on the Philippines to basically figure out whether they should try to get to that point as well. Should other countries invest in developing the institutions to promote international labor migration the same way the Philippines does? So I think there's a lot to be gained from studying the Philippines in particular. In work of mine that's a bit more than a decade old now, and work to come that I'll be talking about shortly, I've exploited a natural experiment to understand the impacts of migrant income on Philippine households and Philippine origin areas. So speaking of Philippine households, first of all, the Asian financial crisis in 1997 generated a very large exchange rate shocks on the planet. Many different countries around the world experienced big depreciations of their currencies, but those exchange rate shocks were heterogeneous across countries. And so Philippine migrants, being located in many different countries around the world, more than 100 different countries around the world, experienced very, very heterogeneous and exogenous shocks to the exchange rates of the currencies they were earning their wages in, and therefore this led to changes in the peso converted value of the money they could send home in the form of remittances. So here's just an example of the differences in exchange rate shocks across many different countries where Filipinos work. We've normalized exchange rates here to 1 in July 1996. The vertical axis is foreign currency units. Vertical axis is Philippine pesos per foreign currency unit. So basically a positive movement is an appreciation of the foreign currency vis-a-vis the Philippine peso. And prior to the Asian financial crisis in June of 1997 or July of 1997, there's not much going on. But then after that, there's a huge fanning out of exchange rates that are that you can see here. So the biggest improvements are sort of in the U.S., Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. Sort of relative appreciations as well in Japan, Singapore, and Taiwan, but actually no relative appreciation vis-a-vis the Philippine peso for Malaysia and Korea. So one can take advantage of this this heterogeneity in the exchange rate shock to understand how changes in the value of migrant income from the standpoint of a migrant's home country household in the Philippines affects household decision making and household outcomes. To make a long story short, just wanted to show here sort of one graph, what I find in a couple of papers, and so the vertical axis here, we're looking at the effect of a 25% improvement in a migrant's exchange rate on a variety of different outcomes. So these are basically all impacts of these positive migrant shocks on migrants' origin households over the course of a 15-month period. And the big news here is that these resources from overseas were mostly channeled to investments, in particular in education and enterprises. So we see a big increase in the remittances sent home, and then that leads to a big increase in education spending, increases in school attendance for boys as well as girls. So on the educational front, there are clear positive movements, clear investments in education are happening. And then there seems to be clear indication of investment in small enterprises. Households report increases in hours worked in self-employment. a big increase in vehicle ownership, many of which are reported to be used in household transportation enterprises, like running a taxi or a small bus service. So, quite that was quite striking in the sense that I think a lot of people felt, I think would have felt ex ante if you had surveyed experts in advance. They would have felt that we'd see big increases in consumption, maybe a reduction in labor supply, but not necessarily increases in investment. But that's exactly what we see here. There are minimal impacts on consumption on average, but there is a decline in the poverty rate, which is probably clearly reflective of a consumption moving up in the lower tail of the consumption distribution. But on average, there isn't sort of much of a detectable effect on consumption. And sort of strikingly, no decline in labor supply. So I talked about this higher hours worked in self-employment, but in aggregate, this is basically an increase in self-employment hours and a reduction in other types of work in the market, for example. And so overall, labor supply is kind of flat. So I think that's kind of the big news coming out of this work, from prior papers of mine taking advantage of this natural experiment. Really emphasize, providing evidence that improvements in the resources available to migrants really do lead to positive investment responses in the households from which these migrants came, which again, I think was not necessarily what experts would have predicted in advance if you had sort of thought about this as an RCT and you did a pre-analysis plan and you asked, surveyed, used the social science research prediction plan platform to ask people what they expected the effects would be. So some additional insights from related work, I think. So if we think about more broadly, how does international migration or changes in the resources available to migrants affect households back home? There's a body of research that is very interesting. I list a number of papers here. They'll also be on the reading list that we post online after this lecture. A lot of other insights that I think are worth diving into. So for example, I think David McKenzie, John Gibson, and Steve Stillman have a set of very nice papers on South Pacific migration to New Zealand. Dave, I don't want to steal David's thunder. He's going to be talking about a lot of these papers in his lecture, the very last lecture of this migration module. But I think one thing I'll point out is that sort of immediately after migration, there can be cases where the initial impacts on household resources can actually be negative. When the migrant initially goes away, they're still getting their feet wet, getting themselves established in the migration destination. They may not be sending back enough remittances to make up for any earnings they may have been earning in the home country. So at least in the initial migration stage, there may actually not be these positive impacts. The positive impacts may take some time to materialize dynamically. There's also some nice papers, looking at women's decision-making power in the household. So in many, but not all cases, the migrant flow tends to be male, or at least, you can look at a subset of migration flows that are male. And often you find that the women left behind who are managing the household see improvements in their decision-making power. This is, a nice insight from a paper by Michael Clemens and Erwin Tiongson, looking at the Philippines, also looking at using a regression discontinuity design based on passing or not passing a Korean language test that you need to migrate to Korea. Mushfiq Mubarak, Sharif, and Mahesh Shrestha have a nice paper on a visa lottery from Bangladesh to Malaysia, finding a similar conclusion. Also, that same paper also shows that there can be impacts on a wide range of other demographic areas. For example, marriage, fertility, and new household formation. All of these things may be delayed when migrants go overseas. So migration also has these sort of social and demographic effects on households that have been identified in prior work, and also I think are just really sort of fertile ground for future explorations. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm not going to say much about coping with risk, but just to sort of tee up Mushfiq Mubarak's lecture coming up in a couple of weeks. We know that households in developing countries use a variety of creative strategies to cope with risk, inter-household transfers, risk sharing within a social network, informal credit, savings and asset accumulation. And one key point that's very prominent in the development literature is that these mechanisms often break down or aren't as effective when shocks are aggregate or systemic, shared by all households in a locality. When that's the case, it can be very valuable to have migrants in one social network who are away from one's location and therefore aren't going to be hit necessarily by the same shocks. And so it can serve as a very valuable source of insurance. So migrants can very much help cope with these aggregate shocks in a way that other members of a social network are less able to do. Migrants can send remittances in response to shocks. Migration, and in addition, migration itself can be a coping mechanism. And migrants who are away can actually be facilitators of migration, for people from households and home areas. So just along these two dimensions, I'll let sort of Mushfiq elaborate on this further in his lecture. Migration can play a very important role in coping with risk. I have a couple of slides here, looking at sort of making both of these points in research on droughts in the Philippines, as well as on how hurricanes around the world drive migration to the U.S. But I'm going to skip those for now. They'll be in the slide deck for you to look at if you're interested. So I'm just going to skip over these couple of slides here. So again, keep an eye out for Mushfiq's course lecture on Friday, April 29th. What about the long-run development impacts? Let me see. Let me just sort of be careful about time here. I see a few questions have come up, but I think I'm going to wait for folks to upvote them if they want to, before I decide which ones to answer. So I'm just going to keep going on, and I'll stop in a few minutes to address some of the questions. So what I've talked about so far are short-run impacts when there's some exogenous shock to migration. Say, someone in the household wins a visa lottery to go overseas, or if there's an exchange rate shock that changes the value of migrant income, and therefore the value of the remittances that migrants can send home in real terms. And those are all sort of short-run impacts on the households that are directly affected because they're the households where the migrants came from. But what about longer-run impacts? And what about impacts on entire home areas of migrants? This really starts to get at the development consequences of international migration for the areas from which migrants originate. Now, I think perhaps the first thing to talk about that's very important is the brain drain versus brain gain debate. Let me just sort of tee this up, because this is really what Gaurav's going to be talking about shortly. I think the broad concern here is that migration of skilled individuals could lead migrant origin countries to be worse off just because of the departure of people with high education, for example. But on the other hand, migration opportunities could enhance incentives for human capital investments and also provide resources for human capital investment. And this could actually, beyond the very short run after the migrants leave, if you look over a slightly longer run, this could lead to higher skill levels in the economy overall, as long as not all of the highly skilled or educated people migrate. So Gaurav will be addressing this shortly. Also, I will sort of highlight the presentation that Caroline Theoharides is going to be giving in the migration policy lecture on May 5. She'll be talking about her very nice paper with Paulo Abarcar, on sort of how opening up of skilled migration opportunities in the medical professions led to increased human capital investment in those very same professions in the Philippines. Some other key works that I would highlight is sort of the number of papers that have very nicely shown so-called brain gain. Batista et al. On Cape Verde, Dinkelman and Mariotti on Malawi, and Sresta's work on Nepal, Gurkha migration from Nepal, as well as Chan and Clemens on Fiji. All of these papers have shown in different ways that are quite convincing increases in human capital accumulation in the home country when international migration opportunities open up. So quite the opposite from brain drain, we get brain gain. I think the only paper that I think I know of that sort of documents something that looks like brain drain is a paper by David McKenzie and Hillel Rappaport that shows that in Mexican areas that gain more migration access actually seem to have less incentive to invest in education. And the explanation they put forward is that the migration opportunity that folks are that migrants and potential migrants are thinking about is sort of low-skilled work in the United States. So when you open up migration opportunities for low-skilled work, you could actually reduce incentives to invest in education in home areas. So that's certainly a theoretical possibility, and sort of this paper says that that's possibly a real thing in some contexts. But stepping back more broadly, I think education is certainly a key first order thing we need to be thinking about when we think about migration's development consequences. But it's part of a broader, I want to sort of situate that in a little bit of a broader context. So I think, when we think about migration and development, I think there are two aspects we should be thinking about. There's an international aspect and a domestic aspect. What does that mean? So I think we can think about, increased participation in and better performance in the international labor market on the part of one's citizens as a form of development for the home country or home area. This may be something that's subject to a little bit of debate, but certainly I think that's certainly something we can think about as development. So the sort of having a higher migration rate and working in higher skilled work in the international labor market, we should think of that as a form of development. So we should think about skill upgrading and movement to skilled overseas occupations as an aspect of development. Even though people happen to be located overseas, they're coming from certain areas, home areas, and that's from developing countries. We should think about that as an element of development or an aspect of development. And then, of course, there's the more traditional, thinking about the domestic side of things. So, what are the impacts on home areas? We might think about, loosened constraints on investment in education and enterprises. We might think about aggregate demand multipliers that have positive aggregate demand effects in home areas from international migration. Perhaps even resource transfers that are large enough to help people escape from any poverty traps they might be in home areas. So this brings us to the last paper I want to talk about, paper with Gaurav, as well as Emir Murathanoglu and Caroline Theoharides. And in this paper, we ask, how does international migration income affect long-run economic development in migrant origin areas in the Philippines? So we use a shift share identification strategy. And this map here shows the variation in the shift share variable that we're exploiting across 74 provinces in the Philippines. Lighter colors are quote unquote more positive shocks. As in any shift share, we need a shift and we need a share. So the shifts in this case are these very same exchange rate shocks that I talked about earlier that I analyzed in an earlier paper. The different exchange rate shocks experienced by different migrant destinations due to the 1997 Asian financial crisis. These actually turned out to be useful for looking at long run effects as well, because these exchange rate shocks were highly persistent themselves. We show in the paper that they actually persist up to 20 years later. So the shock that a particular exchange rate experienced in 1997 is highly predictive of where that exchange rate is even 20 years later. So these are actually useful for looking at long run. These are shifters that operate in the long run that we can use to look at long run development outcomes. The shares in the shift share basically are the extent to which each origin area in the Philippines has exposure to a particular exchange rate shock overseas. And that's basically measure that by looking at the baseline pre-shock level of migrant income per capita being earned by migrants from every particular province within the Philippines. Looking, so different provinces in the Philippines may have different exposures, say, to the exchange rate shock experienced by Japan, because they have different numbers of migrants and different amounts of migrant income being earned in Japan by the province's residents compared to other areas. So this is the basis of the shift share identification strategy. We examine impacts of positive shocks to migrant income. All of these shocks are positive. All the home areas receive positive shocks because the Philippine peso depreciated quite dramatically versus other currencies. And so every province in the Philippines got a positive shock to migrant income per capita. But the size of the shock just differed across provinces, and that's the variation we take advantage of. And we look across 74 Philippine provinces over 3 decades. And we also quantify the mechanisms at play in the context of a simple structural model. Let me just give you a brief sense of what we try to do in that structural model. So we're trying to relate a migrant income shock, measured by the shift share variable that I mentioned, ultimately to global income global income per capita of people from particular Philippine provinces. And there's a migrant income component and a domestic income component to global income per capita. The first thing that happens is that the exchange rate shocks, the shift share variable leads to higher, at least a variation in wages per migrant, which itself has a direct effect on migrant income. In addition, these higher wages per migrant may change migration rates over the long run, which also may change migrant income. In addition, the migrant income shock may alleviate liquidity or other constraints on investment in education, for example. that itself can lead to more migration as well, and also may actually change the skill composition of migration. So people may actually migrate in higher skilled jobs, and that could also lead to higher migrant income. Educational investments may also affect domestic income, for sure. And that's been the subject of very large literature in labor economics. Don't need to elaborate on that. In addition, the migrant income shock could loosen liquidity constraints and credit constraints on enterprise investment, leading to higher domestic income as well. So we set up a structural model that actually builds on Garrett Bryan and Melanie Morton's work. The model that Melanie presented last week has a similar structure. And this allows us to estimate the share of long-run impacts that are due to each channel. So let me just say briefly what we find. So first of all, if we just think about the international side of things, if we think about migrant income, there seems to be a virtuous cycle at work. What do we mean by that? So basically, the initial positive shock to migrant income stimulates educational investments in home areas. In the long run, this actually leads, so first of all, to the population as a whole in home areas to be more educated, higher rates of high school completion and college completion in particular. And that then seems to lead to higher skill levels of migrants. We can actually see in the unusual data we have that the migrants themselves have higher levels of skill. They're more likely to be college graduates, for example. And they are migrating more in higher skilled, higher wage jobs. They're more likely to migrate as professionals, quote unquote professionals, for example, in higher skilled occupations than in sort of low skilled service jobs. And this over a 2-decade period actually leads the initial shock to migrant income that we can measure in the shift share with the shift share variable actually to be magnified fivefold over 2 decades. So that's what we mean by the virtuous cycle. You get this initial positive shock, it stimulates educational investments, it leads to higher skill levels, higher college education in the population, for example, and then higher skilled and higher wage migration in the future. And this actually, has a multiplying effect on a magnifying effect on migrant income. So that's what we mean by the virtuous cycle. So that's entirely on the international side of the ledger. And then on the domestic side, we also see substantial increases as well, increases in household domestic income per capita, income in home areas. We actually find that this increase in domestic income is so large that it's actually the vast majority of the increase in global income. So if we, there's a large increase in migrant income by itself, but the increase in domestic income is 4 times larger. So that 80% of the increase in global income is actually in domestic income. In terms of magnitudes, you can think about a 1 standard deviation shock. These are not trivial magnitudes. 1 standard deviation shock measured by a shift share variable leads to about 0.17 standard deviations higher global income per capita in home areas. We see corresponding increases in consumption per capita. So, usefully, the sort of income data and consumption data that we could see, correspond with one another quite closely. We see corresponding increases in consumption per capita in these households or in home areas. And our structural model is useful in sort of revealing the role of different mechanisms. And one that we'll highlight is that about 1/5 of global income gains, both migrant income and domestic income, are due to educational investments. And then the remaining gains are due to other elements, other channels. Let me say a brief word about related work out there. There actually aren't. It's relatively rare to find a good natural experiment to understand the impacts of migration or migrant income on the home areas of migrants. But here are a couple that I would refer you to for further reading. Caroline Theoharides has a very nice paper showing that if in the Philippines also, Philippine localities are quite dramatically affected when by a policy-induced closure of a prior important migration channel. This was a channel of, as it turns out, workers going from in the entertainment industry to Japan. When that migration channel was closed down, we saw reduced household income and higher child labor in the Philippine localities that were previously reliant on that migration channel or previously participating actively in that migration channel. Taryn Dinkelman, Grace Kumchulesi, and Martin Mariotti have a nice paper showing that historical access to migration in Malawi leads to long-run structural transformation in the Malawian localities that were benefiting from a historical migration flow. Not a migration flow that continues, but it was a historical episode of Malawian work in South African mines. So with sort of findings that are quite complementary to what we just shared on the Philippines. So I would refer you all to that paper as well. And finally, look out for Maria Caballero's presentation in the Migration and Networks lecture coming up next week. So she'll be sharing a very nice paper with a similar shift share design to the paper that I just shared with you, looking at the impact of the US Great Recession in 2009 on outcomes in Mexican localities that were closely connected via migration to various US locations that were differently affected by the Great Recession. So that we'll all be looking forward to that next week. So let me stop here. I think this is a good time to stop for questions. So let me look at what's been upvoted here. Okay, I see one that's gotten 6 votes. Any hint on how these effects on origin countries differ according to the type of migration flow, voluntary, economic versus forced? Very good question. I think it would be certainly the research that I just shared with you and the research that I sort of mentioned here in the previous slide is all about voluntary migration, or I guess in the case of Theo Hardy's 2020, the end of a voluntary migration episode. There isn't I don't, at the top of my head, I'm not sure if I know of any papers that I would refer you to that looks at the impacts of forced migration on the outcomes of home areas. Obviously, completely different context, and would be, analysis would be confounded by the fact that the forced migration is, really being motivated by a push factor away from origin areas, and so it might be a challenge to tease out the impacts of that initial push factor, say war or violence that's pushing people out. From the ultimate impacts of the forced migrants or refugees potentially sending back resources eventually. That's certainly an area for future work that I would encourage folks to explore if they have an opportunity. Let me take one more question before handing things over to Gaurav, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end as well. Let's see. So there's. Let me take Nicole Carnos's question regarding the insights of the outflow of skilled workers. Is there some evidence on the effect of the African diaspora moving back to their home countries? I can't think of a paper that comes to mind right now. Certainly the impacts of African migration on present day outcomes have been nicely analyzed by, in this paper, Dinkelman, Cumciulesi, and Mariotti that I just mentioned. I would refer you to that. But I would, I think the sense of your question, if you translate it to a different location, to India in particular, is exactly what Gaurav is going to be talking about right now. So I think I'm going to leave the rest of the questions for the Q&A at the very end after Gaurav's presentation. And let me just say before I turn things over to Gaurav, we could also think about a number of questions related to what kind of interventions that can we carry out, particularly in the space of remittances, to potentially enhance the impact of remittances on development outcomes, improve decision-making and use of remittances on the part of families back home. I've run out of time. The slides are here, and the papers are on the reading list for you to peruse at your leisure. But I don't want to, so I just want, this is certainly a direction that past research of my own and others has explored to really think about financial and other innovations to improve how households use remittances. I'm going to leave things there and let Gaurav take the stage. So without further ado, Gaurav, please take it away.
Thank you, Dean. Thanks a lot. No, this is great for me to pick up from where kind of Dean, you nicely teed me up for this. I'm going to talk about a slightly different aspect of migration. I'm really going to focus on high-skill migration, but how it has these kind of longer-run developmental impacts in sending countries. Particularly, I'm going to focus on the case of high-skill migration from India to the US, and really how immigration policy, US immigration policy, led to a spread in the tech boom from the US to India, halfway across the world to India. And this is joint work with Nicolas Morales at the Richmond Fed. And our story really begins in Silicon Valley in the 1990s, where really with the kind of the decommissioning of the internet, something that some of the audience may be too young to remember, but something that, decommissioning of the internet, the World Wide Web really exploded. And there was a really big increase in demand for computer scientists in the US. So computer science occupations in the US were actually the fastest growing occupations in the 1990s. And they were expected to stay as being the fastest growing occupation moving forward. So here, if you look at computer science employment as a share of all college graduate employment, or as a share of STEM employment, there's been a rapid increase since the internet became a common technology. But this increase in employment, in computer science employment in the US, was actually driven by immigrants. If you look at the share of immigrants in different types of occupations in the US, what you see really is that, at 1994, about 9% of all computer scientists working in the US were born abroad. But by around 2007, about 1 in every 4 computer scientists working in the US was actually born abroad, right? So there was a big increase, this increase in computer science employment was really driven by an increase in immigration in computer science occupations. But these immigrants were not just coming from anywhere, they were particularly coming from India. If you look at the number of computer scientists in the US from the different parts of the world, you really see India is driving this big increase in computer science employment. Partly this was because Indians really kind of captured the H-1B market. Now, the H-1B visa is a high-skilled visa that really allows high-skilled workers to come from other parts of the world and work in the US. By about 2014, at the end of our study period, about 70% of all these high-skilled visas went to Indians. But this is, all kinds of high-skilled workers, computer scientists, doctors, bankers. But 86% of all computer scientists who were coming in on this H-1B visa were actually awarded, this H-1B visas were awarded to Indians, right? So Indians were really driving kind of a lot of this flow of computer science employment in the US. The second highest country at that time was China, and only 5% of these computer science visas were going to individuals from China. So when there's so much, when there's so much flow of computer science employment from India to the US, you may wonder what happens kind of to the Indian-born diaspora in different parts of the world, and where these Indian-born computer scientists are really working. What you really see is, by the end of our study period, for every 10 Indian-born computer scientists working in India, there was 1 Indian-born computer scientist working in the US. So about 1/10, a little less than 1/10 of all Indian-born computer scientists were working in the US, right? So there was a substantial fraction of Indian-born computer scientists that are now working in the United States. So what does this really do to the decisions that Indian students and Indian workers are making in India? Indian students and Indian workers, they're trying to decide, well, should I be, say, a computer scientist, or should I be a doctor, or should I be a banker? And how do they make these decisions? Well, when they're trying to make a decision of whether they should become a computer scientist or a doctor, what they look at is they look at the wages. Well, what is the computer science wage? And what are the wages in these other professions, right? And so they look at the wage premium in becoming a computer scientist, essentially, right? Now, if you look at the wages in India, computer scientists, this number is slightly above 1, which means computer scientists were earning slightly more than, say, doctors and bankers in India, right? So there was a slight wage premium for becoming a computer scientist in India. But if you took into account the probability that you could win this very lucrative H-1B visa, migrate to the US, work in Silicon Valley, and earn a wage that was somewhere between 4 and 6 times higher, so 400% or 6 to 600% higher than the computer science wage you would earn in India. If you take into account this non-trivial probability of migrating and earning this really high wage, you see the wage premium, the wage returns to becoming a computer scientist were actually a lot higher. So Indian students and Indian workers, when they're trying to decide, should I become a computer scientist or not, when they look at the fact that they might be able to migrate under the H-1B program and have a very lucrative job in Silicon Valley, suddenly becoming a computer scientist in India becomes really, really lucrative, right? So what happened as a result was a lot of Indian students enrolled in computer science degrees. So there were, these computer science degrees that were offered by engineering colleges. A lot of Indian students enrolled in these computer science degrees, and you see there was a big increase in enrollment in engineering colleges. And then as a result, there was actually an expansion. More and more engineering colleges were built to kind of meet this demand that these Indian students had for computer science degrees, right? But there are some strange features of the high skill immigration, the H-1B visa program that the US has. The H-1B visa is capped. So that means that there is an annual quota for the number of individuals, number of high skill visas that are awarded each year. So not all these students in India who are getting these computer science degrees can actually come to the US. A large, substantial amount of them actually have to stay back in India because they might not win an H-1B visa lottery. Secondly, these visas actually expire somewhere between 3 and 6 years after you get them. And if an individual wants to come and stay in the US for longer, they need their company to sponsor a costly kind of green card process for them, which takes a long time. There's a huge backlog for people from India. I'd have to wait for, say, 10 years, 10, 15 years before my green card could actually get approved. So because the visas expire, a lot of these individuals might actually have to return to India. So there's this brain circulation that might happen, but because when they return, they've been trained for 6 years in Silicon Valley, they may go back and work in the tech sector in India with these new skills that they picked up. So what's happened as a result of the fact that because of the cap, not all these workers can go abroad, and because of the expiry of the visas, a lot of workers actually return. In the long run, there is a skilled workforce in India. There is a high skilled workforce with computer science knowledge that is working in India. And Indian companies really tapped into this workforce. Indian companies said, look, there's a lot of smart computer science workers in India. These students got training with the prospect of going abroad, but a lot of them couldn't go abroad and a lot of them had to return. Let's tap into the skilled workforce and hire them. And that's really when the Indian tech boom takes off, right? So when you look at the Indian tech boom, about 6 years after the H-1B program started, there's this huge explosion in Indian tech production. A lot of it was actually production that India produces and actually exports back to the US or exports to other parts of the world. So when you actually look at what happens to the share of kind of IT production in the world, what you see is that the US, which was for many decades the largest producer and exporter of IT products, their share actually started declining over time. And by around 2005, India became the largest exporter of information technology. So India overtook the US in IT. So there was essentially this spread in the tech boom from the US to India, partly because of US immigration policy, right? So, what I try to talk a little bit about today is what role did this kind of immigration policy and immigration actually play in the spread of this tech boom to halfway across the world in India, right? So it's talking about the long run economic developmental impacts of immigration policy. So, I won't go into great detail in each of the paper, but to just summarize what we do in this paper is we first kind of establish in the data using different forms of variation and different types of microdata. We first kind of document this brain gain. But what do we mean by brain gain? Well, the increase in the prospect of migrating to the US and earning a very high wage in the US is what actually incentivized students back home in India to acquire skills, acquire human capital, to be able to kind of migrate to the US, right? So there was this upskilling in India with the prospect of trying to migrate to the US, right? So this brain gain is something we try to establish in our paper using variation in the H-1B program, and the fact that the H-1B program basically a lot of them kind of really hire computer science workers. But to actually understand the overall dynamics of what happens, where does production take place as a result, what happens with trade patterns, what happens to overall consumption, what happens to innovation, we need a lot more complexity. And so we kind of build a general equilibrium model where we kind of model a few different features of what we think is going on in the background. Right, we model kind of this occupational choice, Indian students choosing whether to become computer scientists or other workers. We model kind of return migration. So there's not just brain gain and brain drain, but there's also this brain circulation with the return migration. We have trade and we have innovation. So the model is a little bit more involved, but the advantage of doing something like this, an exercise like this, is it allows you to answer a lot wider set of questions. If we just stuck to kind of the reduced form brain gain response, we would be unable to answer a lot of these kind of more nuanced questions like, well, how did high skill immigration firstly affect output of information technology in each country? So where production takes place. How did it affect what the occupational choice in each country? Were now individuals switching to different occupations because of the H-1B program? What happened to wages? What happened to employment? And then what really happened to consumers? And this is something that I think the immigration literature hasn't stressed enough about, which is that a lot of the gains from high skill immigration to the US, for instance, has been the fact that consumers like you and me now are using better computers, better technology. Our lives are a lot easier and a lot better off because high-skilled immigrants came and did a lot of innovation in Silicon Valley that allowed us to actually now do a bread lecture over Zoom to kind of all over the world, right? So consumer welfare really changes as a result of all of this. And then really trying to get into the nuances of, well, what would happen if we didn't account for these kind of brain gain responses in sending countries? What would happen if you didn't account for return migration and so on and so forth? So the model really allows you to do all these, answer all these kinds of questions. So I won't go into detail in the paper. And the paper, I think we posted it in the lecture series. There's a link to the paper. But just to give you a brief overview of what we kind of try to do, the first part really tries to understand how did this kind of demand from the US for computer scientists and for high-skilled migrants from the US, right? This demand from the US, how did it actually affect occupational choice in India? Students and workers in India, how did they respond to the fact that the US was demanding a lot more high-skilled migrants, right? And you can't just look at raw associations because, it could be that, for instance, maybe India was just going to build more engineering colleges and students just happened to want to get computer science degrees and had nothing to do with the US. So you can't just look at raw associations when you try to answer a question like this. So what you really need is some good variation in the demand from the US. And there are a few different sources that we use in the paper. For instance, we look at, changes in the H-1B cap over time and how the fact that the H-1B program has this bias towards trying to hire computer scientists. That affects demand from the US. You could also look at, for instance, well, in this year, is the US trying to hire more doctors from Germany or bankers from Japan? Well, that tells you about the demand from the US for high-skilled migrants, right? And if the US is trying to hire more doctors from Germany or bankers from Japan, well, then do Indians now get more medical degrees or try to become bankers, for instance, right? So let me give you a flavor of this change in H-1B cap. For instance, the H-1B cap, which is the quota, that the number of visas that the US hands out every year. If you look at the blue line here, this is how the H-1B cap changes over time, right? And over that, I've plotted the growth in engineering degrees, in enrollment in engineering programs in India, on the other side of the world. Really what you see is, as the H-1B cap changes, when it's raised, there's a bigger growth in new enrollment in engineering programs in India. When the cap falls, there's a bigger fall in engineering programs in the US, in India, right? And if you read a lot of the qualitative literature, you'll see similar discussions where essentially commentators in India talk about, look, how did this initial growth in training and degrees were in India in engineering programs and computer science programs was driven by this very high salary in the US, right? So they want this prospect of migrating to the US, because a lot of these visas were just going to Indians, right? So this prospect of migrating to the US and winning this H-1B visa and changing their lives in many different ways is what really drove a lot of students to enroll in engineering programs, right? At that time in the 1990s, like I showed you, there was really not any jobs in computer science occupations in India. So why were they getting computer science degrees? One of the big reasons really was to go abroad to the US. When you do an analysis like this, you might wonder, well, what about demand from other countries? There might be Indian migrants to the UK. Is it just about the US, or is it about a demand from the UK, demand from Canada or Australia that's really driving a lot of this increase in upskilling in India? Well, to be honest, if you look at, for instance, this is the number of workers going from India to different countries. Well, if you look at the US, the IT sector in the US, kind of really swamps anything else you'd see, for instance, in the UK or in Canada. In fact, the largest occupation, the largest flow of Indians to the UK was actually not in IT, but in the medical profession. There were physicians going to the UK. But the magnitude of migration under computer science occupations from India to the US really swamps a lot of the kind of other kinds of migration you see to elsewhere in the world. So we kind of take this these reduced form facts and try to put it in a somewhat more involved model, because we want to understand, for instance, the model has a few different ingredients, 3 or 4 different ingredients. Let me to kind of capture the different dynamics of what's going on. So firstly, we had to model dynamic labor supply, which means you want individuals to choose whether they become computer scientists, what they study in college. Do they study computer science major, do they study something else? After they graduate from college, do they work in computer science or work in a different occupation? This kind of job choice really is important, because that's really what's going to allow you to kind of have this kind of brain gain response in India, especially because when you're studying for a computer science degree, you don't know whether you're going to win an H-1B visa. So this uncertainty of what will happen to your future migration is what really drives this brain gain response. But it also means that because of these dynamics, in the short run, when the H-1B cap changes, you may have very different effects from what happens in the longer run, right? So the longer run economic developmental outcomes can be quite different. You'll also have the fact that this occupational choice actually mitigates a lot of the impacts on immigration in the US. So what do we mean by that? Well, when there are more computer scientists in the US, you may expect that the computer science wage in the US might tend to go down. But what actually happens is that you see a lot of US-born workers switching to managerial occupations. So they become the managers in these tech firms. And because they switch to managerial occupations, that actually mitigates the negative wage impacts on computer scientists in the US, right? So occupational switching is important from the US side as well. And then of course you have the brain circulation with the return migration. The other thing that's important in the model is you want to model consumption as well, because what's going to happen with the IT sector is that there's going to be a lot more production in the tech sector, right? And we may not have realized this, but actually consumption in information technology has been one of the fastest growing parts of our national income accounts in the US. For instance, if you look at different types of products, there's been a huge growth really in the fact that we are consuming more software and information technology in broader ways. And that really benefits us as consumers. Our entire lives are changed when there is more immigration that actually allows us to produce more and more of these products, right? And it might not seem like our computers are getting cheaper, but actually they are getting a lot cheaper once you adjust for quality, once you adjust for RAM and memory, once you adjust for the power that our computers have. You actually see that there's been a huge reduction in actually the price of computing. And that, again, has changed our lives in many different ways. And this is, again, something that's understudied in the immigration literature. But I think that a lot of the gains from immigration actually go to consumers like you and me, who are actually consuming a lot of the products that immigrants are producing. And then, of course, there's a lot of innovation that happens in the tech sector, so that has to be modeled. I'm going to show you a graph from Bill Kerr and Bill Lincoln, who have this paper on patenting in the US, and they show that, immigrant diasporas really do a lot of the innovation, and increasingly over the last few decades have been doing a lot of the innovation in the US. And then what's important is that you have this kind of production. So for instance, what we actually have is the tech sector is actually an input into other sectors. So, but what do you mean by that? Well, what we mean is, automobile production actually uses a lot of software today. Banking uses a lot of software today. So when there is innovation in the information technology sector, it actually raises the productivity of the automobile sector. Our cars are better. It raises the productivity of the banking sector, because software is an input into all these sectors, right? And if you look at actually a lot of the growth, a lot of the more recent growth is not so much from the tech sector, but half of it is from the tech sector. But a lot of it is actually driven by industries that use technology as an input into their production process. And then the last thing is we kind of have this international trade, where international trade is quite important. I already showed you this graph, but essentially it's important to capture the offshoring of production from the US to India. A lot of this production gets offshored. So let me quickly try to summarize what we find. Well, the model basically sets up the fact that there could be some ambiguous consequences of immigration. Well, there's this tension, like I said, between brain drain and brain gain, because a lot of, on the India side, there's this ambiguity because a lot of the smartest people are leaving, but a lot of people are now getting more and more skills with the prospect of leaving. And then there's this brain circulation that's going on in the background as well that helps in many different ways. On the US side, you might think that immigrants firstly expand the tech sector, so that's good for the US. But on the other hand, there's this other tension, which is that, that when there is more upskilling in India, there's offshoring of production to India. So production might actually shift away from the US. So again, there's this tension as to what actually happens in the US. And then, of course, different types of workers in each country are affected in different ways. When there are more computer scientists in both countries, it might actually lower the computer science wage, but the innovation might actually tend to raise computer science wages. So again, there's ambiguity as to what happens to computer scientists. For non-computer scientists like managers, there might be actually, when there are more computer scientists, there might be more demand for managers or warehouse workers in Amazon factories, for instance, or HR people in these tech companies. So what happens to non-computer scientists is also quite interesting. And then, of course, consumers, like I said, are going to be better off from these lower prices. So to summarize, what we find is that, the H-1B program had a big impact on welfare. If you if you cut the H-1B program by half, you'd actually reduce welfare in both countries on average, by to the extent of about $50,000 per migrant. Of course, most of that gain goes to the migrant themselves. What we find in this paper is that the brain gain channel actually is larger than the brain drain channel. So India benefits quite a bit from this H-1B program. There are, of course, distributional consequences, different types of workers. Some workers might be hurt, but on net, a lot of the workers are actually better off. And, I won't go into, with the interest of time, I won't go into the different mechanisms, but, you'll have my slides to see how return migration plays an important role, how trade plays an important role. You can do different things like vary the cap size or restrict this H-1B migration to in different years to see how different things might play out. So the general equilibrium model makes it quite powerful to study these different aspects. And then, of course, trying to talk about how else we might model these things. For those of you who are interested in general equilibrium modeling, you might think about how else we might model these things and how they might affect the results that we find. So I'm going to stop here with the summary of the results we find to allow us to kind of really open up for any questions for either based on what Dean presented or anything that I presented right now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Gaurav. So folks should feel free to put questions in or upvote any of the existing questions. Perhaps we can start with a question from Hee-Sung Kim. What is the difference in basically contrasting what might be the development impacts of long-term, what we might call permanent migration, compared to the impact of temporary or short-term migration, mostly for labor purposes, on the sending country. So contrasting the impacts on the sending country of permanent migration versus temporary migration. Gaurav, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I actually, maybe let me share my screen really quickly again, because I think it's an interesting question. And, thinking about, for instance, this tension in our paper about return migration, right? So what is short-term migration doing in our context, for instance? If there is a lot of return migration, well, the good thing from the India side is that there's this brain circulation going on. People might go to the US, acquire a lot of skills, come back to India, set up either Google Bangalore, or they could start their own startup. So this return migration, the short-term migration can actually help India a lot. But if the return migration is quote unquote not as voluntary as we might think, it's because the fact that your visas expire in the US, what does it do? If it's short term, right, and it's because your visas expire, well, then the gain from migrating the US is not as big as one would have hoped, right? Because you have to come back in 3 or 6 years. So fewer students will try to acquire skills to go abroad, because anyway, they have to come back. In the long run, they'll have to work back home in India. So it's not as lucrative to get these skills if they have to come back, right? So there's a tension there, right? On the one hand, these return migrants, the short-term migrants, might bring back skills and help India. But on the other hand, if you have to come back, you may not acquire skills in the first place, right? So I think it's actually quite nuanced in certain ways and how these things might play out. I don't know, Dean, if you had some thoughts about this.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very reasonable. My thoughts on that question in general are that I think that the effects could go in a variety of directions on net. On the one hand, when migrants become permanent, when they move permanently, they may bring their immediate family with them, or establish their own nuclear households in their destinations, in their migration destinations. And for both of those reasons, they may start having looser ties, looser sense of obligation in particular towards people remaining behind the home country, and therefore may send fewer remittances. So I think one thing that one can see quite clearly in U.S. survey data is that sort of the longer a migrant is in the U.S., the lower the likelihood of them sending remittances to their home country. On the other hand, an offsetting effect is that the longer you're established in the U.S., the higher, on average, your income is going to be, and the better your ability to send remittances, to have other, provide other assistance to your home areas. I think, on net, it still seems to be the case that, the longer you're in the U.S., the lower the amounts of remittances you send home. And I think this is probably true about other destination countries as well. But Gaurav's case study is sort of like a nice one. The IT industry, in the sense that in some sense the really big gains may actually come from migrants who have been established in quote unquote permanent migrants in the U.S. for a long time, going back to start businesses, or being some sort of catalyst for innovation or business creation in the home country. And that doesn't require a large number of people. You just need a few people, a few quote unquote geniuses, or really sort of mover and shaker type of people to go back and do that. I think this is very much an open question of study, and is ripe for a lot of further investigation. So very good question. Let's see. Just looking at the questions here. So what might some potential drawbacks of international migration be? I think the one that's most prominent for people is the so-called brain drain, which doesn't actually, it's interestingly, and I think that the effect could go, in different contexts you might get brain drain, and others you might get brain gain. It seems like the majority of studies, they're looking at the question in various different contexts, are actually finding more evidence of brain gain than brain drain. But brain drain might still be a possibility in some contexts. And sort of the related phenomenon of Rappaport and McKenzie showing that you might have reduced incentives, not only the departure of skilled people, but reduced incentives to invest in education if the migration flow that opens up is actually involves low skilled work that doesn't require education. I think perhaps the most obvious other drawback that should be mentioned, and that's implicit in everything we're talking about, is very simply that international migration, in particular temporary labor migration, involves separation from one's family and separation from one's home, society, culture, context. And that has utility costs. Migration is not something, even though sort of, we started off by talking about how 13% of the world population wants to live in a different country. The flip side of that is 87% of the world population doesn't. So certainly, that almost certainly reveals the importance of the value that people place on being in their home area, in their home culture, society, speaking their home language. So migration is a cost. The broad point is that migration is costly from a psychological and utility standpoint, and that offsets. I think we should always keep in mind that offsets some portion of the income and economic gains from migration. I think that's quite prominent in non-economic discussions of migration in the popular press, in more broader discussions of migration outside of economics. This point gets made more prominently. I think we should never forget that. Let's see. There's a question that got 2 votes, and this may have to be our last question because we're nearing the end of our time.
Yeah, Ormias from Addis Ababa. If
Yeah, you want to.
So useful. If migration is so helpful, why aren't host countries willing to accept migrants? Yeah, Gene, I'm also curious to hear what you think. I think a lot of there's actually this very interesting paper I read by 2 political scientists, Jens Heinzmüller and Daniel Hopkins, and you guys should check it out. It's called Public Attitudes Towards Immigration. It's a review of about 100 different papers on attitudes towards immigration, trying to really answer this question: if migration is so good from an economic standpoint, why are host countries so unwilling to do it? And they argue a lot of it's just a review paper of all these different studies, and they argue that a lot of the pushback against migration is not necessarily for economic reasons. It's for what they call sociotropic reasons, which is that individuals are uncomfortable with with different cultures kind of being around them. I'll try to maybe I'll try to post a link to the reading list. But economists, I think, have not studied this thing about attitudes as well as much, but political scientists, I think, have done a really good job of trying to unpack some of these issues. I don't know, Dean, if you have any more.
No, I think I'm sure that's right. No, I've seen some of the same evidence that, it's really when you ask people about their sentiments about immigration, the negative views towards immigration or towards expanding immigration in developed countries is not primarily because of economic reasons, but actually because of social cultural reasons. Sort of like the immigrants will change the culture.
Right.
So I think that this is a good question in the sense that it really gets to the real challenge with thinking about international migration policy as a tool in the development economists or the development policymakers toolkit. I think one of the big implications of all of this work that we shared today is that developing country governments and publicly minded agencies, NGOs should be thinking more about international migration policy as part of the development toolkit. Should be thinking about ways to we should be thinking more prominently about international migration when they think about development policymaking. The challenge, of course, is resistance to migration. These on the part of destination countries. What that probably means is taking a step-by-step approach, much the same way the Philippines and several other countries have done over the past couple of decades. You're sort of taking step-by-step, negotiating bilateral agreements between the origin country and the destination country to open up just a little bit more migration, a bit at a time, perhaps in periods of particular sort of needs for additional labor, like various there was always some news when U.S. When new opportunities open up to migrate to the U.S. in the medical professions, or when the U.S. is recruiting teachers during times of teacher shortages. There are going to be these opportunities that allow us to move step by step a little bit, open up migration opportunities a little bit more. So I think governments in developing countries need to be open for look out for these opportunities and engage in these sort of the hard work of negotiating, new migration openings, new bilateral migration openings, wherever they might be. All the time, looking out for these opportunities and trying to help their citizens take advantage of these opportunities. Well, I think we need to wrap up. Thank you all for attending, and hope to see you all at the next 3 very exciting lectures on migration and risk, migration and networks, and migration policy. One after the other in the next 3 weeks. Thank you all for coming, and take care.
Thank you.